Hello everybody, Dark Skeleton here, and today is a great day because the card nerfs for the Old Gods expansion set in standard mode are finally out. So we can look through all of these cards which have been giving everybody a pain in the butt since pretty much vanilla, and look at how they're pretty much going to be unplayable or very situational now. So starting up, we have Ancient of Lore. It's a 7 mana 5/5 draw a card to restore 5 health. The nerf is that it used to give you 2 cards, which was ridiculous. Now it only gives 1 card, which is much more reasonable. Drawing a card is still better than an alternate effect, say the 6 mana 5/5 Grand Crusaders add a random Paladin card to your hand, because a card from your deck is generally going to be synergetic with the rest of your cards in your deck. So, that's still a pretty good effect, and it can still be used to restore 5 health, which for Druids usually is their only ability to restore health. So this isn't necessarily going to be removed from Druid decks, but it's definitely a lot more in line with the power of 7 drops. It's maybe not an auto-include anymore, but it's still pretty good. Just not ridiculous to where Druids never ever run out of steam, and the moment they get you to 14 health, you get comboed to death and die. Speaking of combo, another nerf, Force of Nature, is now a 5 mana spell, summon 3 2/2 treants. They do not have charge and they do not die at the end of the turn. This is clearly a nerf to the Druid combo. It just won't exist in its current form anymore, where you could Force of Nature and Savage Roar for 14 damage or more if you had extra minions on board. Savage Roar is not one of the cards getting nerfed, so you can still Savage Roar, and Savage Roar is still a pretty darn good card. But the problem is you have to have minions on board, enough minions on board to where that Savage Roar becomes ridiculous to finish your opponent off now. No just finishing the game straight from your hand. Now, 5 mana for 3 2/2 treants is actually not too bad. That's 6/6 stats for 5 mana spread across 3 minions. It's alright, especially if you have some kind of spell synergy going on in your deck. That could still be pretty good. Another idea that comes to mind is the Soul of the Forest. Soul of the Forest plus Force of Nature. That could be a new combo for more durable Druid decks. 3 2/2 treants that death rattle into 3 more 2/2 treants, and if you played that when you already had the board, then you get to the point where basically your board's just unclearable because you have so many death rattle minions. But that said, the main point here is that there's no more combo, which is huge. So Druid is going to play dramatically different now. Another card that was an auto-include in every single Druid deck was the Keeper of the Grove. It's now a 4 mana 2/2 instead of a 4 mana 2/4. It still has the powerful effects of dealing 2 damage or silencing a minion. However, a 2/2 for 4 mana is actually pretty sad, so even though those effects are powerful, it may not be an auto-include in decks anymore. Not too much to say beyond that, but a 2/2 that silences for 4 mana is something you actually have to think about putting in your deck. And the Battlecry deal 2 damage, it's okay, I guess, now. It was good as a 2/4, but now it's just kind of an okay-ish card. I think maybe decks would run one of them. But honestly, if you're going to be paying 4 mana for silence, you could pay the same amount of mana cost and get Spellbreaker as a 4/3 silence, which honestly might end up being like the new silence card, especially because Ironbeak Owl is also getting nerfed. The nerf is +1 mana, which is a pretty big deal. So you're paying 3 mana for a 2/1 minion. The Battlecry to silence a enemy minion or one of your own minions is pretty powerful, true. But it's nowhere near as broken as when it costs 2 mana for this effect. So I think what Blizzard's trying to say is if a card has an insane Battlecry, then the stats should suck, or the mana cost needs to be way too high for it to just be like an auto-include in decks. And more evidence of that is Big Game Hunter, one of the nerfs I've been waiting for like forever, because you don't want to really play big minions in your deck, except for Dr. Boom, because Dr. Boom is just so good that it's good enough to play against a Big Game Hunter deck. So Big Game Hunter, it's a 4/2 Battlecry destroy a minion with 7 attack or more. That part hasn't changed, but now it costs 5 mana. In other words, you probably wouldn't put it in a very tempo-based deck because that's just too much mana to ask for having a random card in your deck. Basically, people could play Big Game Hunter because a 4/2 for 3 mana isn't terrible in itself. But now that it costs 5 mana, if you don't get that destroy a minion effect off, it actually really sucks. Having to pay 5 mana for a minion, given it might be the last card you play, it's still going to hurt a lot. And when you do get the battle cry off to destroy an enemy minion, it'll still be really good, but it won't give you the ridiculous tempo gain that you had before. It'll put a 4-2 on the board, and maybe you can put another weak minion down, and that'll be still kind of good, but it won't be absolutely ridiculous. And yeah, this is much more in line with the value of this card. So this card is good if you get to destroy a minion with 7 attack or more. I think it's gonna not be in mid-range decks anymore, but you may still see one copy of it in something like a Control Warrior, which usually sits there half the time anyway and has plenty of extra mana to spend. I wouldn't see why a deck like that would need to remove the Big Game Hunter, because they just want enough answers to make sure you don't overwhelm them, and it's still an answer. Next, Hunter's Mark. This is one I actually didn't see coming, but change a minion's health to 1. It's now a 1 mana card, up from a 0 mana card. It's true, 0 mana to basically take out any big creature in conjunction with like a web spinner is pretty ridiculous. It was really powerful. Some mid-range decks would even run 2 copies of it. And it's still good at 1 mana. It's kind of like the Soulfire nerf, where it's ridiculous at 0 mana. 0 mana, deal 4 damage, discard a card. But for 1 mana, it's still pretty solid. I mean, I think if you were playing a Control Hunter deck, you would still put this in. 1 mana isn't going to make too big of a difference. But for decks that are really tempo-based, like mid-range, that 1 extra mana is going to slow you down a little bit. Like, if you're on turn 6, you can't Hunter's Mark and play your Savannah Highmane. And situations like that will matter. So, I think it's a fair nerf. Just one that I wouldn't have really prioritized. Okay, next up, Blade Flurry. This card was abysmally annoying, or more like tremendously annoying, because you pay 2 mana and you get to basically clear your opponent's entire board and deal a lot of burst damage. It still has that component with this card, but they doubled the mana cost to 4. I think 3 may have been okay, but 4 definitely means that you're not going to really cheese the game out as easily with a Blade Flurry. So the problem was you could AoE clear the board, then put down like several minions, and basically close the game out just by sitting on a 4-1 dagger or something like that. And then basically anytime the rogue wants, you can just clear the board. And that was really powerful. That's what made Oil Rogue work. Tinker's Sharpsword Oil is rotating out of standard, and Blade Flurry is a lot less good now that it costs 4 mana, so different types of rogue decks are definitely going to have to come around for this to... or for rogue decks really to stay viable, because this is a pretty big nerf just in terms of pure damage. Next up, Knife Juggler. One of those cards that makes its way into a lot of aggro decks. It's just been a really strong card for a long time. So, it's now a 2/2 2-mana minion, down from a 3/2 2-mana minion. It still has the very powerful effect of dealing 1 damage to a random enemy whenever you summon a minion, so it would still be really good with Unleash the Hounds, or similar cards like that. So, in certain decks which have a lot of board flooding potential, you might still run Knife Juggler for that combo potential. But as a turn 2, just put on the board minion, it's kind of a bit weaker. You may run into the situation where Knife Juggler doesn't actually trade with any other 2-drop. It might get punished by, say, a 2/3 River Crocolisk or the equivalent. So probably a necessary nerf, brings it a lot more in line with other 2-drops. Like, if you're gonna have a ridiculous effect, it should have 2/2 stats at best. Like, Mad Scientist is still super good with 2/2 stats, for instance. Next up, Leper Gnome. It's 1 mana, 1/1, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero as a death rattle, down from a 2/1 minion. So the problem with this minion before was it just did way too much damage for a 1-drop. Almost in all circumstances, it deals 4 damage to your opponent, or forces them to spend their turn 2 removing this, and then they still take 2 damage. So a minion that not only forces a reaction from your opponent, but also does guaranteed damage is just ridiculous. So now that it's a 1/1, this is the kind of minion you can just kind of ignore a little bit more on the board. Like, the 1 damage to your face isn't going to matter as much this turn, and it's still pretty much guaranteed to get that 2 damage off, but as a 1/1, it's a lot less good. that said, it could be played in wild mode in Hobgoblin decks now, and that's a little bit interesting. So Hobgoblin would make this a 3/3. Death Rattle, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero. Could be a thing sometime. Anyway, that was probably necessary because it was making its way into almost every aggro deck, and, you know, a classic card that's just in every deck of a certain type, like aggro, probably needed to be nerfed. Next up, the Arcane Golem. It's now a 4/4, up from a 4/2, however, it loses the charge ability, so it's a 3-mana 4/4 Battlecry, give your opponent a mana crystal. Sort of like an Ogre Brute or a Dancing Swords, which are neither of which are actually going to be playable anymore because of Standard Mode coming out. But the drawback is pretty huge for 4/4, so give your opponent a mana crystal. Basically, you're paying for a 3/4 that gets 1 extra attack, but your opponent gets a mana crystal. Given it probably will trade for any of your opponent's 3-drops, but you're giving them an extra mana crystal so they can just play a 4 or 5-drop. They can crush this, so probably not such a great card. Unless, of course, you're already on to turn 8, 9, or 10 where that extra mana crystal isn't going to matter as much. I don't know if it would be played in any decks, because the reason it was played before was for its charge potential, like you could charge, Power Overwhelming, Faceless Manipulator it, and do a ton of charge damage. But Blizzard is really trying to take out those charge effects and make it so that, like, one-turn combo kills are not as much of a thing, which is probably healthy for the game, because otherwise it's like, whoops, you didn't have a taunt, the Druid kills you, or whoops, the Warlock drew the right cards, so I guess you just get Arcane Golem, Power, Faceless, you're dead. Yeah, not super fun to lose like that. Next up, the Molten Giant. I'm not sure this one was actually necessary, but I mean, I guess I'm not going to argue with the Blizzard design team. They know better than me. But Molten Giant is now a 25-mana minion. It costs 1 less for each damage a hero has taken. So in order for this to cost 1 now, you would literally have to be at 5 HP. Basically just saying, like, plus 5 mana to the cost of this card is a really big deal. I mean, let's see. If you're down to 10 HP... you could play a Molten Giant for 5 mana, and you could play a Defender of Argus to make it a 9/9, or a Sun Fury Protector to give it taunt. It's not really that special, because it's already a huge deal if you're that low on HP, to be at 10 HP for 5 mana minion, because odds are, unless you have some super crazy comeback mechanism like Molten Giant Taunt Healbot, your opponent might just be able to finish you off with a couple of spells. So, because Molten Giant was mostly played for its ability to be played so cheaply in those circumstances, like 1 mana, 2 mana, or 0 mana, and now that it's way harder to make that happen, I think Molten Giant is pretty much going to phase out of existence. The one case I could see it still maybe being played is in wild mode for the Reno Echo Duplicate deck, because a Reno Mage can let, or not necessarily even Reno Mage, just Echo of Medivh Mage, can play Ice Block, so they drop to 0 HP, and then they, 1 HP, and then they play Molten Giant for free still, but it's just not as good. It's really risky for that kind of thing to happen. In any case, yeah, Molten Giant and Handlock, probably a dead thing at this point. I mean, Mountain Giants will probably still be played in Classic Handlock, if that even still exists after this. Because Mountain Giant's still really good for the hand size component, but Molten Giant's way less good for 5 extra mana. Master of Disguise. This is one of those cards where I thought wouldn't get nerfed, and I don't think Blizzard really saw this card as like, whoa, so crazy, so powerful, it gets played everywhere, because it doesn't. But Master of Disguise was a 4-mana 4/4 Battlecry, give a friendly minion stealth, and that stealth was permanent, which does have implications. It makes it really hard to remove a minion that's stealthed like that. There weren't really any decks that were abusing that, because Gadget Sand Auctioneer Master of Disguise is just way too costly, and kind of unnecessary too, because you already had Conceal. And I don't really think there are any minions at the moment that are so broken if you stealth them that you just win the game. I mean, you could argue Kel'Thuzad, but as a rogue, are you really going to have a board like that built up? Is Kel'Thuzad really going to live a turn and then you're going to disguise it? Or are you going to Emperor Thorazan and make it a 10-minute mana play? It's just too gimmicky for it to have really been broken. And now that it gives a friendly minion stealth until your next turn, it's not really much worse. I guess they're just doing that for the instance that there is a card that is super broken with stealth. And I think down here it actually says that they want to open up design possibilities. Yeah. So if you go check out Hearthstone, you can see what the Blues had to say about this. Opens up exciting options for future cards. So I guess they just don't want anything that's permanently untargetable anymore. And that's what's going on there. So overall, I guess with these cards, what could we say about them? Druid decks are going to change dramatically. Combo Druid is 100% dead. Savage Roar is still good. So maybe like a mid-range Druid that just builds up a strong board and then Savage Roar still does a lot of damage. That's a thing. Iron Beak Owl means silence is going to be a lot rarer. I actually think a lot of people may do Spellbreaker as a 4-mana 4/3 silence over the Iron Beak Owl, since that silence didn't get nerfed. And the stats are quite a bit better, so for 1 extra mana, it might be worth it. Big Game Hunter being nerfed means it's going to be seen a lot less, which means that you can actually afford to play a lot of really big minions that you maybe couldn't before, because your opponent is going to need basically hard removal, or to have specifically built a control deck that can afford to play Big Game Hunter. And that's a big deal. That means I can maybe play something like Gruul. Probably not Gruul, because it's not one of the best cards, but okay, Nefarian, maybe Onyxia, you know, cards like that. Oil Rogue and basically Combo Burst Rogue is kind of dead. Rogue's going to have to find a new way to clear the board, or they're just going to have to pay a very costly effect here. Rogues may have to play a lot more board control with minions now that Blade Flurry is gone and Tinker Sharpsword is gone. Aggro decks are definitely getting hit quite a bit with the Knife Juggler, Leopard Gnome, Arcane Golem hits. So, I mean, with those, kind of more late game control decks are probably going to be quite a bit better, especially because Force of Nature, Savage Roar is gone, so the ability to just get comboed down is going to be a lot rarer, and you can feel a lot safer. And maybe that's one argument for Molten Giant being nerfed, because all the things that would counter Molten Giant are also being nerfed, so now Molten Giant would be too good, because it's hard to do the last 10 damage in one turn. But this is going to be a huge hit to Handlock. Echo Mage wasn't going to be a thing in Standard anyway, because Echo Medivh's not there. But yeah, similar decks, which there's not too many of, are going to kind of miss Molten Giant. And really, I think that's a bit about it. So these changes, definitely overall healthy for the game. Without these changes, these cards would just always be played. And yeah, I think it's time for some new Old God cards to fill the gaps in for these previously completely broken cards that were played in so many decks before. So, really good news to see all of this. I've been Dark Skeleton. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.